Well, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, g'day, Espresso here, back in the wood shop. Today I'm working on this. This is an Art Deco inspired digital clock based on a Lixe edge-lit LED display. Now this is episode 7 and I've done 6 previous ones in a playlist which you can go back and check out if you like. And they take in the development of the electronic or the LED displays, the woodworking processes to build the chassis for this clock, the veneering and the French polishing process that I used to get the clock to this stage. Now the finish that I'm going to be using on this clock is a Nitrocellulose lacquer, pre-catalyzed. And this is it here. It's made by Wattle and I use 3 different versions of this in the shop. The first one is a sanding sealer, which I've already applied to the French polish finish on the clock. And that basically just gives you a good smooth base ready for the top coat. This one is a 95% gloss, but I've also got a 50% gloss if you don't want that super high gloss finish. The advantages of nitrocellulose lacquer are that it gives you an abrasion resistant finish. It has a beautiful feel to it. It sort of doesn't have that sticky feel that polyurethane has. It's also resistant to moisture and alcohol, good idea in my case. And it's quick drying, which is a real advantage if you don't have a spray booth. So you can put this stuff on and within 5-10 minutes it's already relatively tack free. It also dries quickly so that you can do several coats in one day. Now nitrocellulose lacquer sounds dangerous, and it is. Cellulose plastics are highly flammable, and in this case when it's in its liquid form it is a highly flammable finish. But once dried, the coating is very, very thin. Nitrocellulose lacquers are quite old. They were developed about the end of the 19th century, and they were formed by mixing cotton with nitric acid, and that's where the nitro and cellulose part of the name comes from. It was also called gun cotton and was a very early form of explosive. So that's what I'll be using. I'm fairly familiar with this stuff and I usually get fairly good results with it. Now we're also going to be looking at these little gadgets here. These are the decorative elements that go on the end of the clock, and they're going to be inserted into this end of the clock chassis here. There'll be 4 saw cuts, and each one of these little plastic decorative elements will fit into one of those saw cuts. If you've looked at any sort of Art Deco design, it generally has asymmetric features, at least on household items anyway. And these little decorative elements were quite common on things like radios and clocks back in the 1930s. During that time, these would have been made of some of the very early forms of plastics. The most notable one was casein type plastics, and they were derived from milk and the addition of formaldehyde to create a very durable waterproof plastic. And it was quite commonly used for things like clock cases, combs and brushes and that sort of thing. Bakelite was also extremely popular back at that time, and Bakelite was a thermo-setting resin, and I'm not sure about casein-based plastics, but another alternative would have been something like ivory or mother of pearl. These are made from a laser cut acrylic. This is like a translucent white acrylic. And these little notches, in case you're wondering about those, they are to give the glue somewhere to go when I fit these into their saw cuts. And the notch on the end here is just to ensure that I don't have to cut all the way to the end of this element here. I can stop the groove short, and that way I've got less chance of splintering the finish. So we're going to go ahead now and give this a spray coat. I'm going to be using a HVLP spray gun. That's high volume, low pressure. And that has the advantage that you don't have a lot of overspray when you're putting the finish on. So we're going to get the gun set up and we'll get outside and we'll give this a coat. Now, I've got my clock broken down into 4 parts, so I can spray all these separately and do the assembly later. These pieces are the feet that go on the bottom of the clock chassis. This is the back, which encloses the rear of the clock, and it's veneered on both sides. And that will be held on with some small nickel-plated screws at a later stage. Now, if you look in the previous video, you'll see the preparation that I've done at this point. What I've done is I've done a fine sand on the sanding sealer with I think 320 or 360 grit sandpaper, and I've rubbed this all over with steel wool, and I've been very careful to check for defects before I do this next step. Here's the gun that I'll be using. It has its own built-in regulator, and I'll give this a thorough clean, make sure it's all set up properly before we get going. As you can see, this is my spraying area. It's sort of outdoors, it's completely in the open. Two things about that: it means that you're not stuck inside breathing fumes, but you're also at the mercy of the breeze and debris that blows down out of the trees and so on. But I normally get these sprayed and then get them inside relatively quickly so that nothing's likely to settle on that. The biggest culprits are insects and little bits and pieces from the trees. The other thing I need to be doing here is to make sure there's no areas like these screw holes and so on where there's waste and products from the sanding process sort of lodged in there. So I'm just going to blow all this down with compressed air. I've already wiped this all down with a cloth. And in case you're wondering, I am doing two of these cloths. So there's one for my son, one for me. And unfortunately I missed my deadline. These were supposed to be finished by the 22nd of December, which is my son's birthday. But you know what it is about deadlines. I mean, I love deadlines. I love the sound as they go whooshing past. But here we are, it's the 31st of December. Okay, so the finish I'm using here, the recommended thinner rate is between 5 and 10%. Now I've already put about that much thinner in the bottom of the spray gun cup. And I pour the neat paint in on top of that, and that way when you start spraying, you're not likely to get sort of thick solid paint down here in the bottom of the cup. This paint already has a little bit of thinner in it from where I finished previous jobs. I've already given this a shake. It doesn't need a lot of mixing because it doesn't have a lot of solids in it. And just one tip, I was watching a video by Jimmy DeResta a while ago, and he was talking about tips for painting and so on. And something I'd actually done for quite a while as well is to punch a series of holes around the bottom of that rim there, and that way when you pour paint from the can that fills up with liquid paint, it will drain back inside the can when you're done. And you can see how clear this stuff is. It's got that very slight honey colour, which I believe is artificial, but I could be wrong there. And the other gadget I bought is these little clip-on paint pourers. These work really well, especially with this sort of paint, and they just fit in there, and when you tip the paint into here you're less likely to make a mess. My neighbour's using his leaf blower again. Get a rake! Anyway, I talked to a guy once from a paint shop and I said, what's the trick for pouring this stuff into a spray gun? And he said, just aim and go for it and don't stop. So here we go. Okay, it's about 450 mils of paint there, and I don't know if you can see it, I'll just show you close up. But there's the paint dripping back through the holes that I've already put in the rim of that can there. So I'm just going to keep that covered just to stop any dust from getting in there. Okay, let's go. With these high volume, low pressure guns, you've got your own regulator on the coupling, and I checked up on the data sheet for this particular finish and they recommend about 20 psi. Now at the moment that's showing 30, but when I depress the trigger, start the airflow, you see that dropping back to 20. I'm just going to try this out in a bit of scrap material just to check my flow rate, and then we'll get going on the job. So you can see that going on nice and wet, and there's very little overspray on that job there, which is what I'm looking for. And it comes up glossy as soon as you spray it. Because we've got very little volume of air, or very little pressure I should say, it doesn't tend to ripple the wet paint as it goes on. So it's a nice forgiving way of putting this finish on the job. Now I've got these blocks here, they're just bits of MDF with about 6 nails driven in from the bottom, and this allows you to put your material on top there, and you can flip it over and do both sides, even though it might be still a bit tacky underneath. And the other thing that's worth noting is it's always a good idea to do the least visible surface first. So I'm going to put these feet facing that way, and these will be the underside of the feet. Alright, so I can do that surface and then flip it over and do what will be the top last. And if I get any little imprints from the nail heads, it's going to be less visible underneath. Okay, here we go. So I'm just putting on a mist coat first, let that tack off, and then I'll give it a second fuller coat. Remember, this stuff dries very quickly. It's a summer's day here at the moment, and within minutes that's already starting to go tacky. So let's give it another coat. I want to get that on thick enough so it starts to flow out and level off. You might have seen a little bit of texture in that as it first went on, but that will flow out and give you a nice mirror finish. Now, there's that same part after about 10 minutes, and I've given this a second coat, and you can see the level of gloss on that quite clearly. The other thing you may notice is that there are some slight imperfections in that surface there. The grain has raised a little bit, and the thing about this nitrocellulose lacquer is that it shrinks a lot as it dries. So this is by no means set yet. In about 2 or 3 days this will level out to become relatively flat finish. You can also buff this back with some very fine steel wool and a beeswax or a beeswax and orange oil mix if you want to kill that level of gloss slightly and just to take the tops off any little imperfections that are there. But we'll look at this in a couple of days' time. We'll just see what difference that makes. Well, that same part has been sitting there now for about 3 or 4 minutes, and you see that the surface has already started to level out on that. So it looked horrible before, now it's not so bad. Well, unfortunately the sun's moved away, but there's that same part, and you see that the finish is flattened out. Once again, a couple of days' time, that'll be much, much better than that. I've got to the point where this is going to be really troublesome. What I need to do is get a good even coat on the horizontal surfaces, but at the same time I'm going to do these vertical surfaces. If I don't, I'm going to get overspray off that edge there onto that vertical face there. And if I do it the other way around, if I put this flat, this surface here, and spray that, I'm going to get overspray here. At some point I've got to spray both the horizontal and the vertical surfaces, and the problem is that with a clear lacquer in this sort of light condition, if you over paint that vertical surface, you're going to get runs and sags, and with this finish coat it's really hard to correct that. You then have to sort of sand it back and start again. So I'm going to have to be particularly careful to watch how much paint I'm putting on this surface here. So yeah, wish me luck. Well, that first coat is a mist coat, so the idea there is that that will flash off and set relatively quickly but remain sticky. So when you put your second coat on, your slightly fuller coat, it sort of gets stuck to that first mist coat and hangs there a little bit better. But just the same, you've got to watch how much paint you're putting on. Of course, if I had a professional spray booth with overhead fluorescent lighting, you'd get a much better look at what was going on here. Under these circumstances, I'm just going to have to be careful and vigilant. I'm going to try and do this vertical face here first. That top one's no trouble at all. I can put as much as I like on there, or within reason, and it's not likely to sag. Other ones, not so easy to do. What I'm trying to do is sort of look along that surface from the end, and you get a better idea of the gloss level and how thick it is. So far so good. I'm going to leave that for about 3 or 4 minutes, come back to it. Well, I'm sort of a bit reluctant to go any further with that. One of the things I always try and do is take care of that top surface, because that's the one that everybody sticks their hand on when they're having a look at anything like this, and you want that one to be good. Back surfaces, you know, around the bottom, if you've got a defect there, probably no one's going to notice, but I think that's pretty good. We'll just let that set now. I'm just waiting to do a second coat on that second clock carcass, but here's one of the parts I did earlier. This one's been finished now for about an hour, and you can see that surface is already flattened out quite well. There's a little bit of that grain texture still visible there, but you know what, I don't mind that. It sort of reminds you that it is wood and not plastic, and as the finish flattens down and shrinks even more, that'll probably get a little bit more visible. But I think I'm going to finish this with a very light coat of beeswax and orange oil, and that tends to fill in the remaining grain pores, and it gives it that beautiful smell too, which is a little bit better than this nitrocellulose smell. But even that disappears after a period. So let's let all this harden up now, and then we'll do a final, or at least then we'll fit those little plastic fins. That's right, that's what we're doing next. Good on you, Mark. Okay, here's one of the clock frames now, 3 or 4 days later after I finished the painting process on this, and this is now hardened up to the point where I can continue working on this without a worry about scratching it or damaging it. Now, this is one of the little decorative elements that I'm going to be fitting here. This is made from a translucent white acrylic, and it's been laser cut and laser etched. Now, I have to fit 4 of these, 2 at the top, 2 down here, and doing this has been the thing that sort of kept me awake at night recently. I'm terrified that I'm going to damage the veneer or put the saw cuts so they're misaligned, and I have to do this as 2 separate saw cuts, one on this edge here and one along the face. And I've made a jig to help with that process, and we'll have a look at that jig now. Well, this is it. This is a purpose-made sled. I have another sled, but this one's specifically made for doing this job on the clock. And I've made it so that it's just wide enough to fit the clock carcass, just long enough. I've got a stop up here so that when I run the saw cut through across the face of the clock, I know that it's going to stop in the right place and not extend past the end of that decorative plastic part. I've got marks on this blue tape here which allow me to align the saw cuts with the clock carcass where they need to go. And I have tested this out on a piece of stock. This is just particle board, and it's the same footprint as the face of the clock. It's not the same thickness obviously, but it allowed me to run this through and just check that everything was right, because this is a one-shot deal. When I do this clock, if I mess it up, there's no going back. So I've done this twice, and I've just refined the technique a little bit, and I think I've got it pretty close. Okay, so I think this is how it's going to work. I put this blue tape on the veneer so that it's less likely to chip out. This is a pretty good quality Freud blade. Hasn't done a lot of work, it's still pretty sharp, so I'm hoping that that's going to preserve that veneer pretty well. So the tape has been placed over the front there, well past where the saw cut stops, and I've burnished that tape down pretty hard. On my sled I've got 4 pencil marks at the front and at the back, and they allow me to position that frame where the first saw cut will go. So I'm not so much relying on this at the back here to get the alignment. I'm using my pencil marks on that tape. And we're going to run this through the blade until it hits the stop at the front here. And then we repeat that 4 times, so we do 4 saw cuts there. Then we have to stand the whole thing up like that. And we've got to repeat that process so the saw cut goes through the end face as well. Now I've got a little key to help with the alignment when I do that, and this is the one that's got to be absolutely correct. If there's any misalignment at all between the saw cuts on this end face and the front face, then it's going to be immediately obvious. Like I say, I've rehearsed it a couple of times and I've got it pretty good, but it's always the real deal where it can go wrong. Okay, so let's try this first one. There's the first one. That's just dust that'll wipe off. Okay, so let's do that 3 more times. Look all right? Okay, keep going. Okay, they're all done, and just so you know, you can't foresee every single thing, but that saw cuts come right through the inside of the case, but it's probably not going to be a problem, I hope. Okay, here's the second part of this process. What I need to be able to do is continue these saw cuts down that face there and out through the back of the clock. And the idea was that I was going to put that onto the same sled and align this saw cut with the saw cut in the base of the sled. But unfortunately this has sort of got a little bit oversized as I've used it. So I made an acrylic key, and I can fit that into the existing saw cut and then look down and do my visual alignment this way. And like I say, this saw cut is about, I don't know, 0.1 of a millimeter thicker or wider than this saw cut here, but visually I can center it. I'm just going to hold all this in place with a clamp just to make sure nothing moves. And I can take that key out and do the cut. Now, I almost screwed up big time. I had this saw blade set to about 11 millimeters deep because I wanted this saw cut to be deeper than necessary, and that takes care of this corner, which I'll show you in a minute. But I almost went ahead and did this saw cut here, and it would have showed through on the back of the clock and would have left an ugly gap. So, crisis averted. I, for once in my life, actually thought it through, and I think I got this right. So let's do this one. Alright, so there it is there, and I just realised you probably didn't see that saw cut, so I'll shift the camera, I'll do one more. Alright, you should be able to see the whole blade there. Okay, there they are, all finished. Let's take it over to the bench, see if those plastic parts fit. That's another thing I was terrified of, that the tape was going to pull the finish up. But good thing about this nitrocellulose is it does dry quite hard fairly quickly. So that's releasing the tape quite nicely. And remember, the reason why I put the tape there was to try and stop the veneer from chipping and splitting, and it seems to have done that quite well. Okay, moment of truth. Nice. Okay, that went better than I expected actually. Now these all have to be polished on these laser cut edges, and I think I'm going to secure these with a very, very thin smear of epoxy. Won't need a lot. In fact, they could probably just sit there like that and no one would ever know. And you can see I got lucky too. This is where the plastic decoration stops, and the saw cut is almost directly underneath that point. So luckily I got that bit right too. And I think what I need to do, this is what I was talking about before, the plastic part here has a little bit of material right on that inside curve there, and these saw cuts don't quite have enough depth just at that point there where they cross. where they join it actually. So I might need to cut away a little tiny bit of that material in there, or cut away a little corner in here in order to get that to fit, because I've just noticed that it's not quite coming all the way through to the back just here. So a little bit of fettling and that's all going to work. Yay! These laser cut edges, although they're dimensionally accurate, because of the way the software interprets that curve, it actually cuts that as a series of staircase moves. So it's quite serrated and rough, and it needs to be polished. So I'm going to cut this back with a 240 grit dry cut paper, although you can use wet and dry, and then I'm going to buff this out on the buffing wheel. After that buffing process, you always get a little bit of build-up of wax on that edge there. So the next step is to buff this with just a dry cloth to remove all that waxy residue. It's always a good idea to leave the paper on until you've done this buffing process. It just protects that face from any abrasion from the wheel. You can see on this edge there's still a bit of that black wax there. Alrighty, so there's a nice shine on that. It's probably not showing up in this light, but I'll get all of those done and then we can do a trial fit and just see how everything's looking. Well, there's 4 of them done now, and you can see they're nice and shiny on that curve. So let's get them in the clock and see how it all looks. Oh, shiny. Well, I think that looks nice anyway. These pieces aren't yet glued in. I'm going to leave that right till the last minute, just in case I need to touch up any scratches on the face of this. In the next video, we're going to have a look at making this little brass bezel that fits inside that window. Now, I have to make 2 of these. This is the prototype, essentially, and I'm going to make a second one on the next video. And this is going to be nickel plated when it's done. Now, I bought a new nickel plating solution and a heater for my nickel plating bath, so we're going to have a look and see if that makes a difference to the quality of finish that we get. So for now, I'm going to finish up here. Thank you to all those people who sent me wishes for the new year. I appreciate that. It's also nice to hear from people who are watching along with this this build and giving advice, and that's always great. So I don't normally say this, but feel free to like and share the video. It'd be nice to get it out there in front of some more people. So I'll finish up here now, and I'll catch you on the next video, and thanks for watching.